Now, as you said, the goal of strategic nonviolence is to mobilize or maximize public, the public in, into common spaces. Now, when you succeed, when you're able to put 1 million people in a place like Tahrir Square, or Azadi Square, in Tehran, is there an implied threat of violence when you've got all of these people staring down at the state saying you must go, or staring down at 5 or 6,000 policemen?
Not really. I think what it implies is that the regime no longer has power, because power ultimately rests on the consent and acquiescence of the governed. And so when the regime says no gatherings of more than 5 people are allowed, and when people say their curfew is at 6 p.m. and people disobey it, it sends a very powerful signal about who really has the power, who really is in control. And that's, if people start attacking police or government buildings, people can they can get people to gun down the protesters. They can use that military force. But it's much harder to do that when people are nonviolent. I mean, the defections are obviously a lot higher, or refusals to obey commands are much higher if soldiers are ordered to shoot into unarmed crowds than if people are shooting at you, or even just throwing stones and Molotov cocktails at you. So so the big threat when you have the masses of people there is the recognition that the state is actually losing control. And that that nonviolence is a bigger threat, because nonviolence hastens the possibility of massive defections in the security forces.
Well, I think this is an important question, because right now we're seeing the second wave, if you will, of the Arab Spring in places like Syria and Yemen, where people are coming out on the streets, but they're being met by gunfire. Now, I think it's almost too much to ask for people to stand there and allow themselves to be shot. I mean, in most cases, crowds break, and they retreat to the safety of homes, and they'll try and come out later. But I mean, that's the moment at which a movement faces a fundamental choice. Can movements be successful and remain nonviolent when faced with overwhelming state violence? I mean, because look at Iran. They had millions on the streets, and today the regime is stronger than ever. I mean, it's lost legitimacy, but it's in control.
Well, that's key, though. The fact that the Green Revolution hastened the day the regime falls. It did not fall as soon as people wanted it to, obviously, but they really lost legitimacy in huge portions of the population because of that repression. And we saw, the Shah was certainly willing to use enormous repression. Many thousands died, were gunned down in the streets. So people just kept on coming back. And here, that's the dilemma of the regime is, because using violence against nonviolent protesters, Gene Sharp uses the term political jiu-jitsu. Aikido may be more appropriate, but whatever.
You use the regime's force against them.
Exactly. And so that you gain any kind of struggle, you're going to lose people tragically, but you tend to a lot more people tend to be killed in armed struggle, and but you don't have a situation where we took up arms, we had this battle and we lost, therefore armed struggle doesn't work. It's just illogical to say the same thing around nonviolent struggle. Not whether it be a guerrilla war or whether it be a nonviolent strugh you got to think strategically. You got to diversify your tactics. So in other words, there are some situations where you will not want to mass all your people in the streets. If it's a particularly brutal regime and they have a particularly loyal segment of security forces who are willing to use severe repression. It might be a time for a tactical retreat, use any of the multiplicity of other tactics of boycott, strikes, smaller scale actions, occupations, things like that. I mean, the difference between, say, Solidarity in Poland and the Chinese students during the 1980s was the Solidarity occupied their plant. They didn't go to the middle of the government square in Warsaw and demand the communist system come down. They occupied their plant, asked for some specific things, including recognition of a union, and kind of built their way up from there. Whereas the Chinese, the Chinese students, unfortunately, were the equivalent of a guerrilla army wanting to do the final offensive before they had a mass base of support in the countryside or anywhere else. So it's not as much violence versus nonviolence as you got to think strategically about what's going to work.
Right. Well,
and remember, in Egypt we had 800 people killed. Tunisia close to 400.
Yes.
So it doesn't mean that Bahrain, Syria, Yemen aren't going to be successful eventually. I think they will.
Well, you mentioned Gene Sharp, and you've mentioned the importance of clear and consistent strategy. There have been a number of media reports in the BBC and elsewhere, for example, Foreign Policy, about the influence of thinkers from the Albert Einstein Institute, such as Robert Helvey and Gene Sharp. The fact that some of their books have been found translated in Arabic in Tahrir Square. Reports about the training of activists in places like the Canvas Center in Belgrade. How do you personally assess the impact of these ideas and these strategies in the successes seen so far in places like Egypt and Tunisia?
Well, I actually took part in one of these seminars at actually the Impaldun Center in Cairo, and I was one of the people who actually introduced the Serbs to some of the Khalafi people. But I'm very familiar with this connection, and basically what we did and what the Serbs did was helped get people thinking about the history and dynamics of strategic nonviolent action. But nobody gave advice, nobody gave money, nobody gave any kind of any specific tactical details. And even when we first had this conference, 3 years ago in Cairo, I was already impressed at how much these people have been thinking about these issues already. So I think it's important not to deny agency to the Egyptians themselves, not to.
In other words, the outside world didn't create.
Yeah. There's not a Lawrence of Arabia type person, coming in and leading this uprising. This is very much their thing, just like a Clausewitz or Al-Zouk, or somebody can help a guerrilla fighter or military strategist think about sort of the general things. They aren't responsible for what actually happens
for the successes
in the struggle. And similarly, writings of Gene Sharp and others, could help people help conceptualize in a broad sense the kinds of things they need to think about. It's still very much their movement, their strategy, their tactics.
Well, I think this is very important because I think as these reports have come out, there have been fears that this in some way, especially given the fact that, I think there have been reports that both the Albert Einstein Institute and Canvas have at various points accepted funding from the U.S. government. There's this concern that this somehow taints.
No. In fact, the only funding Albert Einstein Institution got was a couple tiny grants from NED and IRI to translate some of Sharp's work back in the 90s. They're tiny grants compared to, so they're certainly not a U.S. funded entity at all. And Canvas, again, very little. They might have gotten some support from some congressionally funded project entity for some particular workshop somewhere, but their operational budget, they're very much they're very independent, kinds of organizations. Again, I think it's important not to deny agency to the people who were doing this. And in any case, when you compare, these very small, indirect, one-time grants compared to the $70 billion of U.S. aid to Prophet Mubarak over the past 30 years.
There's a difference there. And would you say that would you say that there's a particular kind of worldview that informs the strategy of nonviolence, a liberal democratic worldview, and do you think that the strategy, the sort of mimetic propagation of this strategy, fundamentally shaped the mass movement that emerged, and perhaps the nature of the regimes that will come to power?
Not in an ideological sense per se, but I do think there's something about how one sees power. Again, this more pluralistic, kind of model. That power is ultimately depends on the consent of the governed, as opposed to conceptions of power where power comes from the top, and therefore to have power you got to
seize power from above.
From above, exactly. And so, and history, and this kind of a perspective, combined with, I think, the very fact that for nonviolent movements to succeed, you have to build broad, coalitions. You include not just able-bodied young men, like in an armed struggle, but a mass, young and old, men and women, and in the case of Egypt, Christian, Muslims, secular and religious, intellectuals and workers, the huge cross-section of society. That tends to bode well for a democratic transition. Whereas an armed, self-appointed, armed elite vanguard with martial values brings in a very different kind of perspective, and that's why
even when they might have some sort of conceptual commitment to social justice.
Exactly. But that's why empirically we've seen when dictatorships are overthrown through nonviolent action, they almost always evolve into democracies. There have been a few exceptions, most tragically Iran, but in '79,
or even for example, Egypt in 1919.
But almost all the time through it goes in a more democratic direction. Whereas armed struggles often is not, indeed, can involve into another dictatorship. Another thing is, but also I think it's significant to note that. There's an article came out on international security a couple of years ago, and it's now going to be coming out in a book form this summer by Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth, that look at 323 insurrections against dictatorships or colonial rule or foreign military occupation, and found that nonviolent struggles were successful 52% of the time, whereas armed struggles were successful only 24% of the time.
Right. So your odds basically double.
Yeah, exactly. If again, this is not a we're not this is not a normative question. I have a lot of respect for people in the pacifist tradition, but but what we're talking about here is strategic choices, and the evidence is stronger and stronger of the strategic efficacy of nonviolent action.
Well, Dr. Zunes, I think this is a fine note to end on. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for sharing your personal insight and this important work and these important insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you.